Rod Sims is used to being the man in the middle as the Chief Economics Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, as the highly visible chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Just in recent weeks, he inadvertently found himself in the middle of something else when Woolworths Chief Executive Brad Banducci stormed off a Four Corners interview after inferring that a Sims opinion was irrelevant because he is, quote, retired. Well, far from retired, Sims is a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And he joins me now. Rod, always good to chat to you. There's so much happening in your space at the moment. There is supermarket inquiries, quite clearly. There is Facebook and the whole issue of Meta and where we go to with that agreement between publishers and those digital media organisations here in Australia. There's also the whole issue of climate change and how Australia addresses it without creating new monopolies, duopolies or concentrated market power. Let's start there. Is Australia capable of actually doing this? Because even in that energy space right now, it is fair to say we have concentrated power in the hands of a few individual companies.
So, Ross, with the climate change issue, I'm very keen to focus on the real opportunity Australia has to take advantage of its really inexpensive renewable energy and make things like green iron, green aluminium, green urea. Let me just give a quick example if I could. So at the moment, we export the iron ore, we export the metallurgical coal, which you need to reduce the iron ore to iron metal, and we export the gas or thermal coal to make the energy, and all that goes to China and they make the iron metal there using fossil fuels. In the net zero world, the way to make iron metal is use renewable energy for the heat, and you need a lot of renewable energy to make green hydrogen. Hydrogen substitutes for metallurgical coal, but you can't. It's really difficult and expensive to export renewable energy or hydrogen. So the economics flip. What was economically sensible before to export all those things, it's now sensible to make the green iron in Australia because the main ingredients you need in a net zero world are very hard to export.
Okay, because even this week I've been hearing of, say, Rio Tinto considering making, again, hot briquetted iron in the Pilbara. Now, BHP, of course, famously had a disaster of a project going back 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but now they're thinking about the value add yet again. And so this is what you're talking about. You can value add to the final product here in Australia, which means Australia becomes a manufacturer to the world and not an importer of those manufactured goods.
Well, it's iron metal mainly.
Yes.
You'd probably send the metal off to be made in steel overseas, or you could make the steel here. But this isn't processing for its own sake, Ross. This is saying in the world dominated by fossil fuels, I'm quite happy to accept it made sense to export the iron ore. But when you've got to use renewable energy and hydrogen, they're very hard to export. And most of the countries, well, the countries, China, Japan, Korea, they don't have the renewable resources to do it themselves. The only way they'll meet their net zero targets is if they're importing products with the embedded renewable energy in it. And could I just add, if we turned our iron ore into iron metal, that would reduce world emissions by 3.5%, 3 times the benefit you get from decarbonising Australia. So if you're interested in emission reduction and interested in Australia's prosperity, taking advantage of that renewable energy, particularly up north, is definitely something to do.
Who should fund that? The government? Or should it be private individuals like Twiggy Forrest or Gina Reinhardt or people of that ilk?
You need 2 things to make this work. One is you need some form of a price on carbon. Now, the good news is that Europe has a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that will, when you send iron to Europe, if it's got emissions in it made with fossil fuel, you'll pay a levy. If it's green, no emissions, you won't. And green metal will be cheaper than fossil fuel metal in that carbon, with that carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Okay, but is there any political party in Australia that's got the guts to impose a carbon price, given the fact as the history of prime ministers losing their jobs over that exact same issue?
Well, first of all, Europe's done it, and it's the Europe market we've got to get into. What we have to do in Australia is convince the Europeans that we have zero carbon products or an equivalent regime to what they've got. So one way to do it is for Australia to have a carbon price. The other way to do it is to find ways to prove our green credentials. We could do it in either way. But I think if people understand the opportunity, Ross, the carbon tax in the past is always part of dealing with climate change, and gosh, it's a burden to do it, gosh, it's costly, all the rest. This is an opportunity for Australia that could underpin our prosperity for 20 years. So it is something Australia should be grabbing.
Okay, let's change subjects. I want to go to the whole issue of Meta and Facebook and the News Media Bargaining Code, which you as the ACCC Chair brought into Australia. You were the architect of that. It was a world first. It was replicated in some ways by Canada. Now Meta says Facebook, it will walk away from that agreement. It will not pay. What does the government do?
The first thing the government can think about, well, should I just say, I think it's irresponsible and arrogant of Facebook to do what they've done. The first reaction of government could be to designate Facebook, Meta. I guess if it was Meta, you'd be designating Facebook and Instagram, for example, under the News Media Bargaining Code. If they're designated, they're required to negotiate in good faith, and failure to reach agreement, you arbitrate the price of news.
What do you sense they're going to do, though?
Well, the concern is that they'll do what they've done in Canada. Canada largely followed the Australian model, but they automatically designated Facebook or Meta. And so what Facebook have done in Canada is to remove all news. So there's no news on your feed. You can't even post a link to another user if it's a media link. You can't upload it. And they've done that so they're not covered by the Canadian code. If they did that here, they wouldn't be covered by our code either.
But given the fact that Facebook is a way in which people now communicate through its messenger in particular, if there's a crisis in a particular part of the country, I'm wondering where, say, for example, there's a universal service obligation, as there is with Telstra, as there is with Australia Post. Why is there not one of those on these types of media companies?
I think these are issues that need a lot of thinking, Ross. So I think in relation to what Meta have done, we need to think not just within the News Media Bargaining Code, as we've talked about designation, but if Facebook were to take down all news, I think we need to be thinking beyond that. And when you have large platforms operating in your country, there is an issue about what their obligation should be in terms of showing news. It's not just the emergencies you're talking about. If they're not showing news from trusted sources, and we've got a wide array of them in Australia, then they're showing news from untrusted sources. And I don't think that's healthy for our democracy. Whatever people think of media, and I know there's always a spectrum of views out there in the public, but getting that news where you've got a common set of facts, albeit different opinions, from news organisations that have requirements around them about how they behave and how they don't behave, you get a much better policy discourse in the country. And without that, I think it threatens our democracy and our society. So I think there's something for government to think about in what you've just said.
All right, one final one, quick one, and that is Brad Banducci. You and I haven't spoken since his famous walkout on that Four Corners interview where he referenced you as having been retired. But do you feel any sympathy for a chief executive under those circumstances, clearly with an ACCC inquiry and other government inquiries on top of him? And of course also this whole thing where you've got to continually defend your organisation against what are allegations of price gouging.
Oh, look, I do. I texted Brad after the program just to make sure he was all right, because he looked in not a good way. And look, Brad is a delightful man. I've always got on very well with him. I think all he was trying to say is that I'm out of date on the latest facts in terms of the competitive environment. I'd left 18 months ago, but irrespective, knowing Brad, he didn't mean anything unfortunate in that, and he wasn't being nasty in any way. He's not that sort of person.
I'll tell you what, Rod Sims, always good to chat to you. We'll do it again shortly. Many thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ross.